It might still be in your way. Okay.
No, that's totally perfect. Thank you.
Sure.
Hold on here. I just need to click here, and there we go. So, really, I think a really worthwhile topic, a really interesting topic. What is my lens? Multicultural considerations and perspectives in opioid use disorder treatment. As I was preparing it, I thought a lot about what to include and what not to include, right? Obviously, this is a very important topic, especially for us here in New Mexico, right? And we can do an entire module talking about this. But I have, as Anthony pointed out, about 40 minutes. So in that time, what I did not want to do, and I specifically did not do, is go into specific cultures, with the fear that in such a limited time, just by bringing up things about specific cultures in general, I run the risk of actually perpetuating some of the stereotypes, right? That might exist within different cultures without having enough time to really process it, without having enough time to really delve into it. So that's not something I did. And instead, I stuck to more general themes. So that's the first thing. The second is, as I thought about it, I kept coming back to the idea that for as long as opioids have been around, which is millennia, opioids have been always intertwined with cultural conflicts. And that should always be in the backs of our minds when we talk about treatment of opioid use disorders. Therefore, I'm really going to start with cross-cultural conflicts that have really defined the entire history of opioids, for centuries. Because that makes like anything, any treatments, any legislation around opioids a loaded topic. So I think at the very least, it's important for all of us in the field to appreciate the basics of that history. We'll talk about how culture can be protective, but also a risk factor for development of opioid use disorders. And then I'm going to go into some of the core cultural competencies for counselors and therapists that have been defined by SAMHSA and that should be nurtured. Learning a general approach to a cultural formulation and the role of the community. And I'm going to end, if we have time, with a case example of incorporating medication-assisted treatments for opioid use disorders within an indigenous treatment model, just to highlight some of the challenges that this can present. So a lot to cover, but I think we can do it. So I'm going to start with a brief history. And again, the three words that came to my mind when we talk about the history of opioids is culture, colonialism, and conflict, right? So opium poppy. So all opioids kind of go back up to opium, right? And opium occurs in the opium poppy, in the seed pod. And basically, if someone wants opium, they go in there and scrape out the opium from the seed pods. Vast majority of the opium poppies are naturally grown in a narrow, sort of a 4,500 mile stretch of mountainous region that starts in Turkey, extends across Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, cutting across to Myanmar, and then to Laos, Yunnan province in China, and Vietnam, right? So along that stretch. And along that stretch, opium has been used for a long time, and opium continues to be harvested. However, opium by itself is generally not trafficked. The reason being because A, it has a pungent odor. So if you're going to market it, whoever is trying to detect it is going to be able to detect it very easily. And second, it weighs a lot because it's heavy. So oftentimes drug traffickers will take that opium and then process it into morphine, which weighs about 88% less. It's colorless and largely odorless. So it can then be turned into bricks and transported. And then morphine is then combined with acetic anhydride to form heroin, which of course has even more psychoactive, even more addictive, and mortality potential than morphine or opium, right? It's been used in ancient world. The record of it being used in the Mediterranean region even before 5000 BC. And ancient Sumerians actually called it hulgil, which translates roughly to the flower of joy. And it was used by all these major empires, including the Sumerians, the Indians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Arab empires, for largely the same reasons why it's used now, as a pain reliever to cure diarrhea. The Islamic physicians used it during their surgeries, much like we might now. It was also used for euphoria and sedation. And there are actually depictions of Greek gods, often Apollo holding sort of a opium poppy, things like that. So it was known throughout the ancient world. And to the right is a photograph of sort of some of the opium poppies taken in Afghanistan. And often some of the people who've been there define it as this pop of color in otherwise arid brown landscape. So pretty easy to distinguish, right? Now, in the Western world, came to the rest of Europe beyond Greek Greco-Roman empires and to the US much later, but in England, it sort of really started coming in the early 1600s. Thomas Sydenham, who's known as the father of English medicine or the English Hippocrates, actually began to use the tincture of opium, where he would combine opium with alcohol to treat pain, insomnia, and diarrhea. And this is a direct quote attributed to him from one of his books. Among the remedies which it has pleased Almighty God to give to man to relieve his sufferings, none is so universal and so efficacious as opium. So he was clearly a big believer in opium, right? Eventually, with the British, it came to the US. And as late 1800s came about, early 1900s, we saw in the US high rates of morphine use, leading to dependence, largely among women of high socioeconomic status. And the biggest indication at that point for opioids was by their physicians for menstrual pain or menopausal symptoms. So it started being used a lot. We talk about the opioid dependence, opioid epidemic now. It's all over the media. We're all hearing about it. Echoes are being devoted to it. But really, the first opioid epidemic in the US hit over a century ago. Number of things happened. One was the Civil War, right? Hypodermic needles were introduced, and morphine was used for analgesia. And the Union Army during the Civil War alone used 79,000 kilograms of opium tincture and over 500,000 pills, right? So it was used a lot. And much like now, our veterans were brunt of this addiction as they came back from the Civil War. Many of them, unfortunately, had developed what we would now call an opioid use disorder. Heroin was synthesized by an English chemist around the same time. And then people said, hey, this really helps pain. This is potent. And Bayer Pharmaceutical, and I don't own any stocks in general, let alone for Bayer, so no disclosures there, but Bayer marketed it from 1898 to 1910 for cough suppression and as a cure for morphine addiction before they said, whoops, we messed up, this is really addictive, and then they rescinded it. And by the late 19th century, there were up to 200,000 people with opioid use disorder in the US, right? So it was prevalent even then. And this is just an image taken right from Google Images of Bayer heroin. So it was marketed. Now, opium historically, I think, has also been associated very closely with colonialism, right? Opium was largely grown during colonial times in India and China. And it was used culturally in culturally prescribed ways, and it was grown there. And colonial powers saw the value, the money, if they controlled the opium trade. One of the things happened in the 1800s was the Chinese monarchy at the time decided to make opium illegal. But there were many people in China who used it. So there was demand. So essentially, the British said, we're going to plant lots and lots of opium in India and then send it to China illegally and make money off of it. And in fact, that's considered responsible for a famine that killed over 10,000 people in the province of Bengal, because essentially food crops, rice, was decimated to grow opium, right, as a policy. And it also led to rising rates of opium addiction in China because opium started flooding China, and in a way where people began to use it not in a culturally prescribed manner. And in fact, it led to 2 opium wars, where British defeated the Chinese to gain greater control of trade and territory. Eventually, it was eradicated and illegalized by the Chinese Communist government in the 1940s and 50s. But beyond that, between that time globally, we saw rates of opium addiction rise pretty exponentially in China. And this is a picture of the British siege of the port of Canton in China. Right? Opium and xenophobia. That's another thing that really strikes me when I think about the history of opium and opioids. Recreational use in ancient China and India spread with the diaspora, particularly during the Industrial Revolution. It was brought to the Britain and the US. And opium became tied to essentially anti-immigrant, particularly anti-Chinese sentiments. There was hysteria around opium dens, with this fear of Chinese men luring white women into these gathering spots. And it actually led to heavy prosecution of smoked opium which the Chinese immigrants engaged in, but not of injected tinctures or oral use, which were done more by the local populations, right, by the dominant culture. So it set up this conflict. And in fact, there are still these testimonies and the actual languages available of congressional testimonies that led to some of the legislation, such as the Opium Exclusion Act. And frankly, it's so racist that I didn't feel comfortable including some of the quotes in here because I would not be comfortable reading those words out loud. But I encourage you to do some research if you are interested, right? From opium to heroin. So why have I included this? Because what we see is culturally prescribed use with norms around it, and often in a way that's less psychoactive, right? Such as the smoked opium, right? Or chewed coca leaves in the case of some of the tribes in the Andes, right? But then it becoming more purified, us figuring out ways to make it more potent, more psychoactive, more readily active, and it becomes heroin, which is a lot more addictive and in many ways a lot more dangerous, right? So why do I talk about this? Why does it matter? This is ancient history, right? But even when we think about it now, right, these cultural conflicts arise. For example, a lot of people pointed out, so, about 2 years ago, the US Surgeon General visited Albuquerque, and maybe some of you were present during some of the some sessions he had. And he was talking about the opioid epidemic. And someone, a community member from Albuquerque, piped up and said, why do we have disadvantaged communities? And how does that relate to what we're seeing now, right? And that's often at the heart of it. When we really think about it, it goes well beyond just heroin, well beyond the opioid epidemic, and really brings into account or brings into focus a lot of socioeconomic and cultural factors. Historically, there have been high rates of heroin use amongst urban Latinx and African American populations, right? However, many people point out that not much was done except jailing them, etc. at that point, but now it's a public health crisis and a lot of resources are being devoted to it. And what are the cultural implications of that, right? And criminal implications of injected heroin versus misused prescription opioids. What are the implications of that? And then just this idea that immigrants may find that their drug is illegal, right? But plenty others are legal, depending on which culture they move to. And how does that affect that particular immigrant or that particular person? So just things to reflect upon, right? So I will start with that. I'm going to quickly glance at the time. I think we're doing good. So I'm going to, with that introduction, I'm going to, hopefully thought-provoking, maybe controversial, I'm going to switch gears and talk about the role of culture in substance use and abuse. First of all, what is culture? Basically, culture is a system of patterns, right, of belief and behavior that shape everything. It's a guide for action. It's a guide about how we see the world, how we interact with the world, and how we behave within the world. It's a sum total of a group's lifeways. And it's important to appreciate that even within a culture, there can be many subcultures, right? For example, the recovery culture or the drug-using culture, right? So I think it's important to keep in mind that subcultures are important. Culture influences everything: communication patterns, values, gender roles, clinical presentations, counseling expectations, and things that really matter in our day-to-day clinical interactions, right? Such as things like gift giving to your therapist, or touching, therapeutic touch, greetings, formality, or even the concept of time and punctuality, right? All of these things can matter. Right? And the worldview really is the lens through which we see the world, right? Worldview, how one sees, thinks about, experiences, and interprets the world. We know research has shown that it develops very early and facilitated particularly by early relationships with parents, siblings, by other role models, and it's shaped by environment and life experiences, and in turn, it shapes many other things, such as our concept of time, family. What are our priorities? What are the things we care most about? How do we relate to self? What is my idea of my family? Is it just my nuclear family? Or do I think about it in a more extended way? How do I relate to my community, and what are my religious and social beliefs are some big ones that come to mind. And we know from research that what is considered illicit can differ greatly between social groups. And what is considered illicit is often culturally determined, right? And there are often codes of behavior around culturally sanctioned use. And norms and sanctions can actually be protective against misuse. So for example, there is data from the Native American church, for example, and also from many of the mestizo religions that grew up sort of in the Amazon basis after the advent of Christianity, where Christianity was combined with indigenous beliefs, and some of these religions emerged, such as Santo Daime or União de Vegetal in Brazil, where they use psychoactive substances. And in all of those groups, including the Native American church and then some of the other mestizo religions, studies have shown that the use of these substances ceremonially actually seems to be protective against alcoholism and other substance use, right? Because it's done in a normative, religiously and culturally prescribed manner, it can actually be a protective factor. So I think that's important to appreciate. So when we're working with a patient, how does that substance fit in within the culture and what effect does that have? And we'll go into more detail of that here in a little bit. On the other hand, at times, culture can also play a role in development of substance use within communities. There's this concept sociologically of anomie, and many of you may have heard of this, right? Essentially, it relates to periods of rapid social change, right? Often in cultures that have a limited experience with a particular substance, and something happens which leads to a total breakdown of cultural norms, mores, etc. And these cultures, because they have had no experience with a substance, may not have those protective normative behaviors. And in cases like that, we can see an explosion, a significant rise in the use of that particular substance. Anomie is defined as the loss of healthy cultural identity in indigenous populations. And it has been tied to high rates of substance use, not just here in North America, but across the globe, right? And tied in closely with that is the concept of historic trauma. And how does that relate to rates of substance use within various cultures? So again, things to think about. Another concept I want to introduce is the concept of acculturation, which is defined technically as a social learning process in which people assimilate the values of the dominant culture while retaining, ideally, the values of the original culture. So in an ideal world, for example, someone who immigrates can retain some aspects of the original culture, their home culture, while incorporating and becoming comfortable within the dominant culture, right? Healthy acculturation, where the person is able to maintain both of these and essentially straddle these two identities, has been shown in numerous research studies to be protective against substance use disorders, including opioid use disorders. On the other hand, unhealthy acculturation, where either the person clings on to the home culture, right, without really incorporating the dominant culture, or swings the other way and essentially detaches completely from their original culture, can actually be harmful. It's been shown that Native American cultures, where people who closely identify with non-native values tend to have higher rates of substance use. There is plenty of literature that shows that culture within indigenous communities can actually be protective, right? It's also been shown that lowest rates of substance use disorders have been found in people who are comfortable with both sets of cultural values. Interestingly, it's also been shown, this research has largely been done in various Hispanic American communities. It's been done with Puerto Rican communities, Cuban Americans, Mexican Americans, where what has been found is that highest rates of substance use disorders are found in people of second and third generation immigrants, and lowest in recent immigrants. And it's been associated with cultural ties, family ties to the culture. So cultural values can be protective. On the other hand, a rapid loss of those values or an unhealthy acculturation can actually contribute to development of substance use disorders. But there are many confounding factors, right? How do you disentangle socio-demographic variables from culture, right? When we talk about high rates of opioid overdose mortalities in New Mexico, cultures could play a role in it. On the other hand, the geographic isolation and lack of treatment access of many of our communities, right? Particularly our rural and frontier communities, and can also play a role. So how do you disentangle that, right? That's a confound. Biases in study designs. Studies are often not designed and not often conducted involving many of our minority groups. There are also biological variables, right, that can lead to higher or lower rates of susceptibility within different cultures. For example, about half of Northeast Asian populations have a deficiency in an enzyme that breaks down alcohol. So when they drink, they basically get an end-abuse-like reaction. They start throwing up, they get dizzy, their blood pressure drops. So these cultures tend to have lower rates of alcoholism, right? But it has more to do with those biological variables than anything particularly cultural. There's also been data showing that things like anger expression, grief expression in various groups can influence how they interact with substance use, including opioid use. So these are some confounding factors. Now, switching gears once more, let's get into some of the core cultural competencies from counselors and clinical staff, and this is largely coming through SAMHSA. And the biggest takeaway point is first, know yourself, right? Know thyself is really the starting point as you start to gain those cultural competencies of working with your clients. You have to understand your own background, right? Reflect on your own worldview. What's my experience? Where do I come from? And how does it shape how I interact with the world? How does it shape how I view opioids, my treatment decisions, and even counseling approaches? It's been recommended that it's a best practice to examine how you have been affected, all of you, all of us, either positively or negatively by societal biases and prejudices, and be aware of those prejudices in a client encounter, the prejudices that we all hold, including myself, including all of you, right? We have to know that, because if we don't know it, it's a huge blind spot, and it can influence that clinical encounter and ultimately adversely affect our therapeutic relationship. It's been shown that counselors, therapists, other clinical staff who are aware of their own culture tend to respect the cultural differences and take into consideration the cross-cultural elements in every client interaction. So that is a best practice. That's a good place to start. Explore your own culture and reflect on where you come from, right? Other things that SAMHSA recommends are understanding the importance of things like role, status, power, and its impact on trust in a therapeutic relationship, right? When we think about it, often our patients with opioid use disorders are highly stigmatized. In fact, research shows that they're some of the most stigmatized patients we may encounter. So right then, when we interact with them in a therapeutic way, there's a power difference, right? For many of us, like the Duke City folks or myself, who work in an opioid treatment program, we also have a lot of power, right? We can hold doses, we can reduce their take-home frequencies, right? And that also sets up a power dynamic that's there, and our patients know it, and we have to be always mindful of it. One of the things I say is that we should always think about anytime we make a decision, what is going to be the impact of reducing this client from picking up, twice a week to 5 times a week, for example? What is that going to mean to the patient, and what is that going to ultimately do to their well-being? So we always have to be mindful of that. The other thing is expand your knowledge. You may work with people of a culture of whom you may have no knowledge, right? And it certainly happens to me all the time. And when that happens, engage in lifelong learning. Learn through clinical interactions, ask them about their culture in a respectful way, but also do outside resources. Become involved, learn, and grow. But accept that you will not know, that now should be not. That changes the meaning a lot. I apologize. Accept that you will not know everything, right? So be humble. And expanding your knowledge, and these are some things to learn about. If you work with a particular community, particular member of a community, what are the patterns of substance use and treatment in various cultural groups? What are the beliefs and traditions surrounding substance use? What are the beliefs about treatment and counseling expectations? Community perceptions, right, about treatment. What are the obstacles and barriers to treatment? Patterns of other co-occurring illnesses that might be important, and culture-specific treatment modalities, right? And I know the term sort of traditional healing gets thrown out a lot, and that's important, but it's important to keep in mind that there might be a whole variety of traditional healing modalities, right? That might differ from culture to culture, often not too far apart geographically. So, don't just lump it all under one, but really learn about the specific treatment modalities along with culturally appropriate peer support. And have a positive attitude towards learning about new cultures. That's exciting, right? We get to learn about something new, and our patients get to maybe teach us, which empowers them and maybe balances out some of that power differential I talked about. And ultimately, we all need to develop, according to SAMHSA, attitudes that reflect respect, acceptance, sensitivity, commitment to equality, openness, humility, and flexibility, right? So the 2 things are, first, know yourself, And second, immerse yourself in learning about the various cultures you work with. And those are keys to becoming culturally competent, right? Now, assessment and screening. So next thing I'm going to talk about is how to do a cultural formulation, right? When we work with our clients with opioid use disorders, I start off with this caveat. Cultural sensitivity does not mean a fixation on culture, right? Like some kind of a fetishistic fixation on culture, and it should not be a ready explanation for the unexplained. I think there is often a tendency that if we can't explain it, it must be the culture. It may be, but it may not be. And we're not going to know until we really engage the patient, until we really talk with the patient. First thing is be inquisitive, but not intrusive, right? You can really drive away your patient if you are intrusive and you start asking about certain cultural practices that might be, that might not be so openly shared with people who are not from that culture for various reasons, right? And that can actually create a treatment gap. So you don't want to be intrusive. It's a patient process of engaging with the community, engaging with the patient, and letting information come to you in an open, accepting way. Again, be familiar with your own backgrounds and biases, and don't make assumptions on race, ethnic heritage, or culture based upon outward things like accents, appearance, behavior, or language. And this is sort of an image that I actually found very helpful, that sort of, but not assuming, right? Here we've got, I think it speaks for itself, so I'm not gonna try to explain it. At the same time, don't generalize. This is, believe it or not, something I found doing research on the internet, which talks about the Western world and the Eastern world, and talks about the differences between the two, right? And we can just see that it lumps together the entire North American, South American, Central American continent. So don't generalize. Everyone's different. Don't assume, don't generalize are two good rules of thumb. What are some aspects of a cultural formulation? Cultural identity may include things like where someone was raised, by whom, what were the ethnicities of parents and even grandparents, and involvement with both traditional and host culture. So example, if you're working with a Native American client, start with what might be the tribe of origin, but also their own identity, tribal or ethnic, right? What was their first language? What do they speak now? What languages can they speak well now? And how this can lead to a sense of either connection or to isolation, whether from the traditional culture or from the dominant culture, because those things can impact opioid use disorders, right? Degree of cultural involvements, any boarding school history, etc., and also traditional beliefs, Native American church involvement, etc. Again, do this in not an intrusive way, but in a respectful and open way. Other things that are aspects of cultural formulation, according to SAMHSA, include asking about things like what are the social stressors and supports, things like religion or spirituality, which can be protective or not. How might the culture influence your relationship with this patient, right? What might happen is important to explore as you establish the therapeutic rapport. And how might the culture play a role in how the patient views or explains her own illness? Can also be an important thing to consider. And this thing doesn't have to, of course, happen the first time you meet with a client, right? Many of you are probably going, there's so much to cover, in treatment planning, how can we do all of this? Well, it doesn't have to happen the first time you meet with them, but certainly as you begin to work with a client, this is something that can be very important in terms of helping you understand the client, but also in terms of establishing a good therapeutic rapport. Now, I want to talk a little bit about treatment implications. Many authors have proposed various models of care, keeping in mind some cross-cultural aspects. One could be separate services for minority groups, and this happens, right? Treatment programs for specific groups. On one hand, some studies have shown that this can actually improve outcomes. So many people are actually comfortable seeing people who look like them, sound like them, who understand them. The flip side, some people have argued that it can promote further ghettoization, right? For traditionally disadvantaged groups, where if the resources aren't allocated equally, then some of these groups can wind up with, with sort of essentially underfunded systems which might influence outcomes, right? So it could be a plus or a minus, depending on how it's implemented. Implementation is key. Another is a cultural consultation model, where care is provided, and this has been implemented in within some of the indigenous communities in Canada, within some of the First Nations communities. And there are specific people who conduct essentially a cultural consultation. They go and meet with the patients, and they also meet with the providers to provide some education and client-specific recommendations. Another is sort of the melting pot model, which focuses on providing the same services for everyone, right? Equality of services, that's a tricky one. Because again, people will point out that, who was involved in the research? Who is the evidence for? And finally, kind of what I think we do certainly at our clinic and many others do, which is sort of this hedge your bets model, where you combine aspects of everything, right? Where you start with some evidence-based treatments, but then really talk to the patient, consider their culture, and modify your treatment based upon what you learn about that client. So these are just some various models of care that have been proposed, and a little bit of pros and cons of all. Role of family and spirituality has been studied a lot when we talk about cross-cultural opioid use disorders, because both of these factors, family and spirituality, can be potent instruments for change, right? Family often is the conduit for those cultural norms. Where do we learn our cultural values, right? Family is the first place where we learn them. And involving the family, learning about the family, doing a sensitive family assessment can often establish patient rapport, patient engagement, and improve outcomes. Similarly, spirituality can actually help form a recovery community. An example of that might be well-briety, which might take something like a Western 12-step model, combine it with indigenous beliefs, and come up with a program that's shown to be effective. Then there is the idea of cultural recovery. When we talk about recovery from substance use disorders, it is important for that person to also recover culturally. And that's something to work towards in terms of a larger recovery concept. It can include regaining a viable ethnic identity. Who am I? How do I fit into the world? How do I interact with where I come from and where I live now? And finding that balance can be protective. As I mentioned earlier, reintegration, right? And re-engagement in recreational, vocational, spiritual activities, and gaining a role in the recovering community and or society at large are all essential for recovery. So I think that is something we should always be involving our clients in and supporting them in this process. And beyond it, again, I was thinking back to the question posed by that community member that I started with. Why do we have disadvantaged communities? And I've thought a lot about it, and I don't have a great answer, and maybe some of you do. But I kind of went off of that and kind of pointed out that healing of the community is also essential. As we treat our individuals, if we're working within a community, we want to work with a community and encourage and essentially work with the community that needs to heal and reintegrate. Multi-generational healing, most experts would point out, is critical when we talk about cross-cultural aspects of healing from substance use disorders, right? And that treatment must happen with community input. Without it, it's not going to be successful. Everything from healers to law enforcement, tribal leaders, community leaders, families. And there are some examples. So, for example, the Alkali Lake community in British Columbia, they had high rates of alcoholism, and they essentially talked about revitalization of tradition. And within a few years, the rates of alcoholism within the community dropped dramatically. And the chief pointed out that community is the treatment center. And I love that quote, right? So we want to involve the whole community. There is also an example of sort of this canoe journey, life journey, which was implemented within some of our Northwestern tribal communities, where they brought back the canoe journey as a means of reconnecting the tribal youth to elders, learning about traditions, and the canoe journey became a metaphor for healthy living, substance-free living. And there, again, the outcomes are quite good, and it's a manual. There is a whole manual for it, and a lot has been written about it, where community healing led to hope, led to recovery of members of a community. So healing of the community along with that individual, I think, is a really important thing to consider. Got a little bit of time left, so I'm going to talk about the cultural appropriateness of Western evidence-based treatments. Again, I want to just introduce things to think about, reflect on in this whatever time we have, and hopefully start a conversation. Example, and I'm going to start with an example of incorporating medication-assisted treatments for opioid use disorders in tribal and IHS substance use disorder treatment programs. There's quite a bit of literature on it. This is data from 2016 that there are about 259 facilities that specifically provide substance use disorders treatment to various tribes. Out of those, 189 are tribally run, 41 are operated by the IHS, and about 4% of those offer an opioid substitution program. That number has actually risen from 2016 on, but I don't have the most recent data. It hasn't been published, but I know that that has gone up, right? So looking at those, while only 4% offer opioid substitution program, 96% of them actually implement at least one Western evidence-based treatment. In other words, it's near universal. They're usually modified. So that's one thing, right? You take a Western EBT and then you modify it to make it culturally appropriate, thinking about it more programmatic, right? Moving forward, so what are the characteristics linked to implementation of medication-assisted treatments within programs serving indigenous populations? So one interesting thing was greater access to trainings and web-based materials and participation in research. Community-based participatory research can often be important parts when we think about it. Other things, training, experience, certainly, but also look at that second to last bullet. Ceremonial providers and consultants, traditional healers on staff are actually associated with a higher rate of implementation of medication-assisted treatments, right? How can that be, right? And the way I took it is that when programs are open to thinking beyond sort of a narrow range of treatment services, they might think about both ends of the spectrum, perhaps, right? Cultural appropriateness remains an important point to think about when we think about treatments for opioid use disorders, right? There was a big study done, number of studies have been done, and this is data from 2015, where they did a focus group, a huge focus group, and they found that 30% of participants cited cultural relevance of evidence-based treatments as a concern, right? Concern around generalizability, mandates and paperwork, lack of research in traditional populations, and individualized care versus wider outcomes, right? And this is a direct quote. I think it was developed by folks that have been out in the field for a while or haven't really experienced culturalized populations, because it's like saying some had evidence-based treatment in Alaska, so if it works for them Alaska natives, it's gonna work for the Hopi down in Arizona. And it's not true. Evidence-based just means that they have found a certain treatment approach or philosophy that helps with a certain population. And it's not true for all populations, right? It's a good thing to think about. It's hard to find anything that is native specific. There isn't data out there, and you can expand it beyond just native populations to many of our populations, right? Even, for example, some of our Hispanic Latino populations in New Mexico, how much research has been done on them? A lot, right? So there are multiple lines of conflict. There is sort of 12-step versus MAT. There's a conflict there, kind of the Euro-American treatments, and then both of them might have lines of tension with traditional beliefs, right, across cultures. So important thing to think about. So what people have talked about is that you take Western evidence-based treatments and you adapt them culturally based upon the knowledge you gain within local populations, the populations you work with in the implementation process, right? So being open, involving people, community-based participatory research are critical to this process. And some authors have proposed this idea of, instead of evidence-based practice, practice-based evidence, right? Which combines culture with evidence-based interventions, where you take research evidence, you combine it with your own clinical judgment and expertise, along with the preferences of the community, consumer choice, and culture, and then you've got something that may be applicable to various cultures. And this is a hard to read slide, but what it essentially says that if you're going to implement, for example, medication-assisted treatments for opioid use disorders within an indigenous model, you have to start with the indigenous, the values of that particular community. It might include an open door policy, involvement of the family, involvement of spirituality, and within those components, adding in MAT, right? It is medication-assisted treatment after all. So medication is assisting all of these things, and then you may have a program that is culturally appropriate and likely to be accepted by the population, and may lead to improved outcomes. And of course, ongoing research is needed. So as we come to 11:50, with time for conflicts, time for questions, I'll present some conclusions, which is that cross-cultural conflicts are an important part of the history of opioids globally. And as clinicians, all of us must develop cultural sensitivity. And this process begins with self-knowledge and incorporates lifelong learning, curiosity, and respect. And a thorough cultural formulation is an essential element of treatment planning. Community is an essential part of recovery, and combining cultural values and community experiences with research-based evidence can help lead to successful implementations of medication-assisted treatments within an indigenous treatment model. And finally, I've included a lot of references. There's SAMHSA Tip 59, which I encourage all of you to read. It's available free of cost. If you just type in SAMHSA Tip 59 into your favorite web browser, you can get it. It's a PDF copy, and it's actually a really good read and gives very specific tools, tips, and even some suggestions on working with various specific cultural groups as it relates to opioid use disorders treatment. So I particularly highlight that and encourage everyone to go over it. So I will end it there. Thank you for your attention, and I hope that was at least somewhat useful. And I'll open it up to questions if we have time. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Bhatt, for that presentation. Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Bhatt on what he just presented on?
Sorry, or your own thoughts and experiences, right? You guys are the frontline providers working with our patients with opioid use disorders. So I would love to learn from your experiences and hear your perspective.
This is Anna, and like I say, I'm a CCHW, and I just want to say that you mentioned a lot of really important information that I feel it's good. You know, it's even with when you work with any patient or client, it's important to know their culture, cultura, like we say, and educating people around us to understand what opioid addiction is, how it develops, and not to be so judgmental. I used to be one of those that used to say, oh, if you want to quit, you can quit, you know, until it hit home, you know, it hit really close to home. And as I was doing my education, and as I take more classes, you know, I get more, and as I'm working along with the patient or the client, I learned so much from them, and I really appreciate your presentation today.
Yeah, no, thank you, Ms. Chavez. And I think that's a great point, right? And I was thinking back, like, to where I did my training, right? My residency training, and it was a very multicultural population. And the trainees also came from various cultures. So one of the things we actually did at one point was we all did a presentation on our culture, beliefs, backgrounds, etc., for the other trainees. And I thought that was a cool activity in a kind of a low pressure, right, safe way, where you could actually educate others and learn from others, and then in turn apply that knowledge when we work with people of different knowledges. So I actually think that can be a great learning tool of just educating ourselves through each other.
I agree.
Hi, I'd like to contribute a little bit. You know, what I find is that the drug culture is so thick and heavy to penetrate. And so some of the things you're saying is having people, like you said, kind of, you know, write their culture story or identify things that kind of keep them, you know, safe in an unhealthy way. You know, it meshes in that trauma and culture that kind of keeps them separate from other people. And I think it's really scary for them to come out of that, not just to remove the substance, but to remove that culture. So it's been really helpful to kind of reflect on that, because that's definitely, I think, just one of the major challenges we have.
Yeah, I totally agree, right? Like, by no means an easy task. So I think my main goal today was just giving things to reflect on. So I'm glad that maybe I was able to do that. So
yes, absolutely.
Answers certainly, but yeah, thank you.
No, right. right?
We also got a question from Annette, and she's asking, is there a preference between methadone, Suboxone, Vivitrol, monthly injection among different cultures?
Yes, Snehal here. So there isn't great research on it, right? Other than to say that if someone is really a part of the 12-step culture, right? That the abstinence culture, then Vivitrol is generally going to be a preferred modality. And there is actually a lot of research on that. But in terms of various cultures, no, it's going to differ, and it often evolves, right? At least in my experience, as the opioid epidemic grows and spreads in even to communities that maybe traditionally or historically haven't had the high rates, the views of the community evolve and change, and I think we just have to kind of go with the flow essentially and keep educating ourselves. But no, I'm not familiar with any research on that.
Is there anything else that anyone would like to add? No?
God, I bored everyone to sleep.
Hello. Hi.
Okay, Brenda's group.
Yeah, well, this is Turquoise Lodge. We just wanted to say thank you to Dr. Bhatt. Great job as usual.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you.